The newest Girls Frontline 2 story update is a big one. Not only does it continue the most recent arc, but it also pushes forward the main narrative thread that's been building since the beginning of the game. So naturally, expectations for this chapter were pretty high. And after playing through the first part, since the second half still hasn't unlocked yet, I have to say that overall it's a really entertaining piece of story. The pacing is solid, the conflicts are engaging, and the chapter does something that a lot of gacha stories struggle with. It jumps between multiple points of view without feeling forced. Now, normally, I'm not a big fan of stories that constantly switch perspectives like this. In many gacha games, those shifts can end up feeling unnatural, or they pull too much focus away from the protagonist's side of the story. But Girls Frontline 2 is one of the few games where this structure actually works. The different perspectives don't feel disconnected, they blend together pretty seamlessly, and the story is clearly built to support that kind of narrative structure. That said, while this first half does a lot of things right, there are still a few moments where the plot feels a little forced, especially when it comes to how the conflict between the protagonists and the antagonists play out. So in this video, I want to talk about what this first part of the update does particularly well, where it stumbles a bit, and why it still ends up being a pretty engaging setup for the rest of the arc. One of the most noticeable things about this chapter is how often the story shifts perspectives. We're not just following the protagonist and their immediate crew. The narrative jumps between multiple groups, multiple locations, and sometimes even different sides of the conflict. Normally, this is something I'm a little skeptical about in gacha stories. When a story constantly changes perspectives like this, it often ends up feeling disjointed. The pacing starts to break down, scenes begin to feel disconnected, and sometimes it even undermines the protagonist because the narrative keeps pulling attention away from their side of the story. But Girls Frontline 2 handles this surprisingly well. Even though the chapter moves through several different points of view, the transitions never really feel random or forced. Each perspective exists for a clear reason, and each one contributes something important to the overall conflict that the story is building. Instead of fragmenting the narrative, the different POVs actually help the story maintain momentum. While one group is facing a setback, another group might be pushing the situation in a completely different direction. That creates this constant sense of movement where the story doesn't feel like it's stopping just to show you another character. It feels like multiple parts of the same conflict unfolding at the same time. And because of that, the pacing stays surprisingly smooth even though the story is covering a lot of ground. This is actually one of the areas where Girls Frontline as a series has always been pretty strong. The writers clearly understand how to structure a story that isn't centered around just a single perspective. The narrative is built to support multiple characters and multiple story threads, and when it's done well, those threads end up reinforcing each other instead of competing for attention. So even for someone like me who usually prefers more focused storytelling, this is one of those cases where the multiple POV approach genuinely works. Instead of feeling messy or unfocused, the chapter ends up feeling bigger and more dynamic because of it. Another thing this chapter does well, at least for most of its runtime, is how it handles the conflict between the protagonist's side and the antagonists. This is something I've talked about before when discussing gacha stories in general. A lot of them have a tendency to make their antagonists overwhelmingly strong in a way that doesn't always feel natural. The villains keep winning, the protagonists keep losing, and eventually it starts to feel less like a struggle between two sides and more like a plot simply refusing to let the protagonist succeed. When that happens, the tension disappears. If one side is clearly destined to lose every encounter, then the outcome stops feeling uncertain. For most of this chapter though, Girls Frontline 2 actually avoids that problem. Instead of a one-side struggle, the conflict feels like a genuine back and forth. There are moments where it seems like the antagonists are getting the upper hand, but then the protagonist's side manages to respond, adapt, and push the situation in a different direction. That constant shifting of advantage makes the entire sequence much more engaging. You're not just watching one side slowly get overwhelmed, you're watching two capable groups trying to outmaneuver each other. And that's an important detail, because the characters on the protagonist side are supposed to be extremely experienced. They spent years operating as mercenaries in dangerous environments. These aren't inexperienced characters stumbling through their first conflict. They're people who should know how to plan, adapt, and respond when things start going wrong. For a large part of this chapter, the story actually reflects that. The characters behave like professionals, the situation evolves in believable ways, and the tension comes from the uncertainty of how each side will respond to the other. That kind of dynamic conflict is something that's surprisingly rare in a lot of gacha narratives, so seeing it handled this well here makes the chapter much more engaging to follow. However, this is also where the story starts to run into a few problems later on, because while most of the conflict feels like a genuine struggle between two capable sides, there are still a couple of moments where the plot begins to push events in a very specific direction, and when that happens, the story ends up relying on decisions that feel a little harder to justify. And that becomes especially noticeable when we look at how the situation surrounding Helena unfolds. That contrast actually makes the weaker moments stand out even more. Despite how engaging the conflict is for most of the chapter, there are still a couple of moments where the story starts to feel a little forced. And interestingly enough, the issue isn't that the antagonists are powerful. Strong antagonists are not a problem on their own. In fact, they're often necessary to keep the stakes high and the tension meaningful. The problem appears when the story has to artificially weaken the protagonist's side in order to make those victories possible. This is something that happens fairly often in gacha narratives. Instead of letting the antagonist outplay the protagonist in believable ways, the story sometimes creates situations where the protagonists suddenly stop behaving as competently as they should, and that's where things start to feel less natural. In GFL 2, the characters on the protagonist's side are supposed to be extremely capable people. They spend decades working as mercenaries in dangerous situations, planning operations, preparing contingencies, and adapting to unexpected developments should be second nature to them, which is why certain moments in this chapter stands out so much. Their entire mission revolves around protecting Helena, a character they've been safeguarding since the beginning of the game. Given how important that objective is, it would be reasonable to assume that they would have multiple layers of preparation in place, plans, backup plans, and contingencies for when something inevitably goes wrong. But when the situation actually begins to collapse, it sometimes feels like those contingencies simply don't exist. Instead, the story occasionally pushes events forward by having things go wrong in ways that the characters seem oddly unprepared for. The protagonists react rather than anticipate, and the outcome starts to feel less like the result of strategic conflict and more like the plot nudging the situation towards a specific direction. The loss of Helena becomes the clearest example of this. Not once but twice in this chapter, the situation escalates in ways that feel a little difficult to reconcile with how capable these characters are supposed to be. And because the story has already established them as experienced professionals, those moments stand out more than they otherwise might. This doesn't completely undermine the chapter, far from it. The overall conflict is still engaging, and the tension surrounding Helena's situation definitely raises the stakes for the rest of the arc, but it does create a noticeable contrast with the earlier parts of the chapter, where the conflict felt much more balanced and believable. And interestingly enough, this is also the point where the story introduces two new characters who end up becoming very important to how these events unfold. Another important part of this chapter is the introduction of two new characters, Alva and Voimastina. Both of them quickly become central to how the situation around Helena unfolds, and they also bring in a lot of history that connects back to the first Girls Frontline game. That's actually something I was a little worried about when I first started playing Girls Frontline 2, because when a sequel leans heavily on characters or events from a previous game, there's always the risk that new players will feel like they're missing half the story. If you don't know the original context, the characters can end up feeling disconnected or difficult to understand. But one thing Girls Frontline 2 has consistently done well is avoiding that problem. Even though these characters clearly have deep connections to the events of the first game, the story does a good job of giving you enough information to understand who they are and why they matter without making you feel like you're missing essential context. You can tell there's a much larger history behind them, but the game never makes the history a requirement for following what's happening in the current story. And both characters are interesting in their own ways. Voimastina, for example, carries the reputation of being one of the strongest dolls in the world. As a second-generation doll, she was previously known as the strongest of her kind, but now she's confronted with the existence of a third-generation doll who surpasses her, which immediately creates an interesting dynamic around strength, identity, and what it means to be replaced by a newer generation. Alva, on the other hand, plays a different role in this chapter's conflict. Her capture by the antagonists became one of the key turning points in the story, creating a lot of uncertainty about how the situation will develop and how the protagonist's side will respond. Together, these two characters add a new layer to the story while also expanding the world beyond the immediate conflict of the chapter. And even if you don't know the full history behind them, they still feel meaningful within the narrative that Girls Frontline 2 is telling right now, which is exactly how a sequel should introduce legacy characters, acknowledging the past without making it a barrier for new players. There's one other thing that stood out to me while playing through this chapter, and it has less to do with the plot itself and more with how the story is presented. GFL2 tells its story in a visual novel format. That means the narrative is built around dialogue, character portraits, background changes, and occasional narration. It's a format that naturally relies more on text than something like a fully cinematic RPG would, and that's completely fine. Visual novels have their own strengths when it comes to storytelling. They don't have the same level of cinematic freedom, but they still have plenty of tools to work with. Character expressions, voice acting, scene composition, and the way dialogue unfolds between characters. But in this chapter, there were several moments where the story seemed to rely very heavily on narration in a way that felt a little unusual. Instead of letting the scene play out through dialogue or visual cues, the game sometimes describes what is happening in long blocks of narration, almost as if those passages were taken directly from a traditional novel. And on its own, that wouldn't necessarily be a problem. If you were reading the same scene in a book, that kind of descriptive narration would feel completely natural. It's the way novels often establish atmosphere, describe movement, or explain what characters are experiencing. But in a visual novel, the medium already gives the story other tools to communicate those same ideas. The characters can react through expressions, the background can change, dialogue can convey tension. Even small shifts in voice acting can communicate a lot about what's happening in a scene. When the story relies too heavily on narration instead of those elements, it can create this strange feeling where the scene starts to resemble a piece of prose rather than an interactive visual story. It's almost as if you're momentarily reading a book instead of playing through a visual novel. This isn't something that happens constantly throughout the chapter, but when it does appear, it stands out because the rest of the storytelling is generally handled very well. The pacing is good, the perspective shifts are smooth, and the character interactions are engaging, which is why those narration-heavy moments feel slightly out of place when they appear. They're not necessarily bad on their own, they just feel like the story is briefly stepping away from the strength of the medium it's using. Overall, this first part of the update ends up being a really engaging continuation of the story. It's clearly a chapter with a lot of responsibility on its shoulders. Not only is it continuing the most recent events in the game, it's also pushing forward the narrative thread that has been building since the very beginning of Girls Frontline 2. In many ways, this entire arc feels like the culmination of a storyline that started more than a year ago, and for the most part, the chapter handles that weight pretty well. The pacing is solid, the multi-POV structure works surprisingly smoothly, and the conflict between the protagonists and the antagonists feel dynamic enough to keep the tension alive. The introduction of new characters like Alva and Voimastina also expands the story in interesting ways, without making new players feel like they're missing essential context from the first game. At the same time, the chapter isn't without its flaws. There are still a few moments where the plot feels slightly forced, particularly when the story needs to push events toward a certain outcome. And the heavy use of narration in some scenes occasionally pulls the storytelling away from the strengths of the visual novel format. But even with those issues, the first half still does a good job setting up what's coming next. Right now, we're approaching a point where the story is very close to paying off a plotline that has been building for a long time. After following these events for over a year, we're finally reaching the point where the narrative has to decide what happens next. And that's what makes the upcoming second part so interesting. We don't really know yet whether this arc will fully resolve the conflict that has been building since the beginning of the game, or if it will simply push the story into its next phase and leave some of those threads unresolved. But either way, this chapter does a good job creating the kind of tension that makes you want to see where things goes from here. After all this build up, it finally feels like we're getting close to a major turning point in the story, and now it's just a matter of seeing how the game decides to deliver on that payoff. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to leave a like. It really helps these videos reach people who care about this kind of analysis. And if you want more videos breaking down storytelling in gacha games and long-running series like this, you can subscribe as well. That's pretty much what this channel is about. And if you want to keep going, I'll leave another video on the screen that you might find interesting. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.